In the year 1572, when the sun set over the ancient city of Toledo, a dark shadow loomed over Spain. This was not a shadow cast by the towering cathedrals or the winding streets, but a shadow of prejudice and fear that had crept into the hearts of many Spaniards. The year 1572 was a turning point, a moment to pause and examine the evidence of a growing obsession with limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. Imagine a world where your family's past could dictate your future. In Spain, this was a harsh reality. Anti-Semitism, a deep-seated prejudice against Jews, was widespread, not just in Spain but throughout Europe. However, the question that haunted many was, how far did this prejudice extend? Were the laws and institutions of Spain truly infected by a mania for blood purity? The answer is complex, and it begins with a look at the institutions that enforce these rules. The statute communities, as they were called, were limited to a few specific groups: the 6 university colegios mayores, some religious orders like the Jeronymites, Dominicans, and Franciscans, the Inquisition, and a handful of cathedrals. These places required proof of limpieza de sangre for entry. It was a strict requirement, but it was far from universal. For example, the medieval military orders, such as the Order of Santiago, also had these rules. If you were a converso, a person of Jewish origin who had converted to Christianity, you were often barred from joining. This was a significant barrier because the military orders were a path to noble status, a dream for many families. The Council of Orders, the administrative body that oversaw these institutions, played a crucial role. If you couldn't join the military orders, your social aspirations were severely limited, but the real picture was far more nuanced. Despite the existence of these statutes, they were not as widespread as some might think. They affected less than a sixth of Spain's seas, and they were almost exclusively found in Castile. In other regions like Catalonia, such rules were virtually unknown until the Counter-Reformation. Even in Castile, many city councils resisted adopting these statutes, despite pressure from anti-converso factions. The statutes were never part of public law and were only valid in the private institutions that had them. Moreover, these rules were always controversial. The Pope himself, the ultimate authority in the Catholic Church, was divided on the issue. Pope Paul IV approved the Toledo Statute, but later condemned discrimination. His successor, Pius V, was a consistent opponent of the statutes. In Spain, a heated debate raged, with many arguing against the unfairness of these rules. Even when the statutes existed, they were often ignored or circumvented. King Philip II, for instance, appointed conversos to high positions in the church and state when it suited him. In 1557, a converso was appointed as a canon in the Cathedral of Toledo, just 1 year after the government confirmed the statute. In 1567, the Bishop of Sigüenza ignored the statute when making appointments. The Inquisition itself, the very institution meant to enforce these rules, often turned a blind eye. Conversos were employed as assessors, and even appointed as familiars without any proof of their lineage. The military orders, too, were not immune to these practices. Prince Philip, later King Philip II, appointed a converso to the military order of Calatrava. When he became king, he continued to tolerate conversos in these orders. In 1589, he appointed a priest of known converso origin as his chaplain in the Cathedral of Sigüenza, despite the statute against it. In city councils, the rules were often ignored. In Toledo, converso families continued to hold posts, and in Cuenca, conversos occupied 50% of the city council positions. The gap between the adoption of these statutes and their implementation was vast. Wealthy conversos found ways to bypass these rules through bribes or fraudulent proofs. The need to prove limpieza de sangre led to corruption and scandal. False genealogical proofs became a significant issue, and the process of verifying lineage was often fraught with local gossip and malicious rumors. Despite the threat of these rules, conversos still managed to rise to prominence. In 1537, Charles V decreed that conversos could attend the universities of Salamanca and Valladolid. Conversos were found as both students and professors in these institutions. Even in regions outside Castile, conversos could hold high positions. Francisco de Cascales, whose father was burned at the stake as a Judaizer, later returned to Murcia and was appointed to a university chair. The Inquisition, while a central figure in this story, was not an infallible judge. Those who completed their penitences and paid a sum of money could be rehabilitated and regain their status. This meant that punishment by the Inquisition did not necessarily ruin one's career. The military orders remained the most significant barrier to status mobility, but even here, the king's intervention could sometimes bypass the rules. Entry into the titled nobility, however, was unaffected by any limpieza rules. The standard treatise on nobility, the Summa Nobilitatis by Juan Arstotelora, affirmed that converts could be admitted to the nobility without discrimination. The Inquisition's punishments, however, could bring shame and infamy, which were the worst punishments of all. The San Benito, a humiliating garment worn by those punished by the Inquisition, was a constant reminder of one's disgrace. These garments were often hung in churches, a perpetual symbol of the family's dishonor. The practice was widely hated, and there were numerous instances of people, including clergy, destroying these garments to erase the stigma. In 1572, Spain stood at a crossroads. The shadow of limpieza de sangre loomed large, but it was not all-encompassing. The rules were limited, often ignored, and the path to power and status remained open, even for those of Jewish origin. The story of Spain in this era is one of contradictions, where prejudice and opportunity coexisted, and the line between inclusion and exclusion was often blurred. In the land of Spain during the time of the Inquisition, the way people were treated often depended on their family history. If someone's family was suspected of having Jewish, Moorish, or other impure blood, it could affect their whole life, even generations later. This was called limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. Imagine you're applying for a job, and instead of just asking about your skills and experience, the employer wants to know everything about your family, going back hundreds of years. That's what happened in Spain. The Inquisition, a powerful religious court, kept track of these family histories. If a person's ancestor had been punished for being a heretic or for being Jewish, even if they had converted to Christianity, their descendants could still face discrimination. One example of this was the San Benito, a special garment that heretics had to wear as a sign of their shame. Even if a person's ancestor had only been punished with this garment, their family could still suffer. People would avoid them, and their children might not be allowed to join certain groups or hold important jobs. The Inquisition tried to control how people talked about these things. It became a crime to call someone a Jew or a heretic if it wasn't true. For example, a priest named Antonio Verganios was banished from his village for a year, just for saying that his neighbor was a Jew. Many people in Spain, especially the poor, believed deeply in the idea of limpieza de sangre. They thought that having even a tiny bit of impure blood was a terrible thing. This belief was so strong that even children learned to be ashamed if their family had a stain on their bloodline. However, some people and groups in Spain didn't agree with this idea. The Jesuits, a religious order founded by Ignatius Loyola, were one of these groups. Ignatius himself came from a region where there were hardly any Jews, but he once said that being related to Christ and the Virgin Mary, who were Jewish, would be a great honor. His followers, like Francisco Villanueva, spoke out against the unfair treatment of people with impure blood. The Jesuits tried to keep their order open to everyone, regardless of their family history. But the pressure to exclude people with impure blood was strong, and eventually they had to make some changes. In 1593, they decided to exclude people with Jewish ancestry from joining their order in Spain. However, this decision was later reversed in 1608, allowing people whose families had been Christian for 5 generations to join. Even some high-ranking officials in the church and government spoke out against the idea of limpieza de sangre. Juan de Mariana, a famous Jesuit, wrote that the marks of infamy should not last forever and that there should be a limit to how long descendants should pay for their ancestors' mistakes. The debate over limpieza de sangre didn't just affect the Jesuits. It also led to a crisis in the Inquisition itself. Some inquisitors began to question whether these statutes were fair or even necessary. In 1599, a theologian named Agustin Salucio wrote a book arguing that the statutes had outlived their purpose and were causing more harm than good. He pointed out that the process of proving purity of blood often led to false testimony, bribery, and lies. Solucio's book caused a big stir. The Inquisition banned it, but the issue was still brought up in the courts, the Spanish Parliament. Members of the courts argued that the criteria for purity of blood were irrational and unfair. They said that in Spain, a common person with pure blood was often considered better than a noble with impure blood. This created two types of nobility in Spain, and it was causing division and conflict. The debate over limpieza de sangre shows that even in a society where these ideas were deeply ingrained, there were still people who questioned and fought against them. The struggle for equality and fairness continued, even in the face of strong opposition. In the summer of 1600, the Duke of Lerma, a powerful figure in the Spanish court, asked the new Inquisitor General, Cardinal Nino de Guevara, to review a controversial book by a friar named Solucio. Solucio's book was a bold critique of the laws that discriminated against people based on their ancestry, particularly those with Jewish or Muslim roots. Many people in Spain, especially those in high positions, were against these laws, known as purity of blood, or limpieza de sangre laws. They believed these laws were hurting the country by excluding talented people from important roles. Cardinal Guevara, after reading Solucio's book, sent a report to the king that praised Solucio as a very learned man and suggested that the book should be taken seriously. However, the debate over these laws continued, and Solucio's book remained banned. But the discussion had already gained momentum, and more people began to speak out against the unfair laws. Around 1613, a man named Diego Sanchez de Vargas, who had Portuguese origins, wrote a book in Madrid criticizing the purity of blood laws. In 1616, a Madrid magistrate named Mateo López Bravo warned that excluding people from honors because of their ancestry would only lead to more discord and rebellion. In 1619, Martin González de Celerigo, a respected writer and Inquisition official, wrote a plea for justice on behalf of those discriminated against, though it was never published. In 1621, an inquisitor named Juan Rocco Campafrio wrote a document arguing that the purity of blood laws were a source of moral and political scandal. He claimed that these laws had divided Spain into two warring halves, and were responsible for most of the civil and criminal trials in the country. He also pointed out that many conversos converted Jews and Moriscos converted Muslims were more virtuous than so-called old Christians, and that the laws were based on a flawed understanding of Christianity. Another inquisitor, Francisco Murcia de Liana, wrote in 1624 that Spain's racialism and xenophobia were causing more harm than good. He urged Spaniards to look inward and realize that no other nation had such discriminatory laws, and that these laws were actually helping Judaism flourish where they existed. Pedro Fernández de Navarrete, in his famous book, Conservation of Monarchies, 1626, also criticized the discrimination against conversos and Moriscos, warning that excluding many people from honors put the entire kingdom at risk of ruin. When the Duke of Lerma was in power, he was opposed to the purity of blood laws, but did little to change them. However, when the Count Duke of Olivares came to power in 1621, he was more determined. In 1626, the Inquisition issued a document stating that since there were few or no Judaizers left in Spain, the strict enforcement of the purity of blood laws should cease. The document highlighted the widespread perjury and forgery involved in proving one's ancestry, and argued that all Christians, regardless of their background, should be united. In 1623, the Committee for Reform issued new rules to modify the practice of purity of blood. These rules required fewer proofs of ancestry and disallowed verbal evidence and rumors. The committee also ordered the burning of books that listed families with Jewish ancestry, like the infamous Green Book of Aragon. Despite these reforms, many institutions continued to ignore them. The Inquisition itself stopped following the new rules after a while, and the debate continued. In 1638, the king issued another decree reinforcing the 1623 reforms, but the laws remained a source of controversy. Prominent intellectuals like Fray Benito de Penalosa and Fernando de Valdez continued to speak out against the laws. In 1629, Penalosa called the laws absurd and harmful, while Valdez argued that Spain had lost respect for them. In 1635, Geronimo de Zabalos wrote his own critique, repeating the arguments of his predecessors. Even as the laws were being criticized, they continued to be used in personal disputes and rivalries. In Logrono, for example, people running for city council positions accused each other of lacking purity of blood. Insults often included racial references, and the word Jew became a common insult, even if it wasn't meant literally. By the late 17th century, the few remaining purity of blood laws were being openly ignored. Conversos and their descendants, despite their Jewish heritage, were able to achieve high ranks and positions. However, in the island of Mallorca, the Converso community continued to face discrimination well into the 19th century. The laws officially ended with a royal order in 1835, and by 1865, proofs of purity were no longer required for marriages or government posts. However, the attitudes that had been shaped by centuries of practice took longer to change. From the 16th century onward, visitors to Spain noted its deeply Catholic culture. They saw endless religious processions, a large number of clergy, and frequent saints' days and holidays. Spaniards were relieved that, unlike England and France, they had avoided the religious upheavals of the Reformation. Church leaders praised Spain as perhaps the only truly Christian country in Europe. Despite the challenges and debates over purity of blood, Spain remained a place where faith and tradition played a central role in the lives of its people. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Spain was a land where the Church and the Inquisition played crucial roles in shaping people's lives. The Inquisition, often seen as a terrifying and oppressive institution, had a different side that is often overlooked. It wasn't just about punishing heretics, it was also about educating the people in the Christian faith. King Philip II, a staunch Catholic, believed that without the Inquisition, Spain would have been overrun with heretics. He was not alone in this view. Fray Felipe de Meneses, a contemporary, echoed similar sentiments, suggesting that without the Inquisition's efforts, Spain might have fallen into heresy. The Inquisition's presence was felt strongly in regions like Galicia, where the religious practices were considered less orthodox. A Galician priest later wrote that if the Inquisition hadn't come to Galicia, the people there might have ended up like those in England, lost in ignorance and heresy. However, the religious life of the Spanish people was far from ideal. Both the clergy and the laity were often ignorant of basic Christian teachings. Religion was more about tradition and community than about deep faith. It was what people did, rather than what they believed. This was especially true in rural areas, where the population was vast and often isolated. Villages had their own saints and rituals, and they were wary of outsiders, including clergy and inquisitors, who tried to change their ways. The Inquisition's role in this context was complex. It was not just a punisher, but also an educator. Inquisitors would travel to villages to remind people of the Church's teachings, and to correct any deviations from the faith. However, their efforts were often met with resistance. The clergy themselves were often poorly educated, and did not always set a good example. In some regions, like the Sierras of Andalusia and the mountains of Galicia, people mixed formal religion with folk superstitions, creating a unique but often backward form of faith. Despite these challenges, various groups within the Church tried to reform religious practices. Humanist bishops like Alonso Carrillo and Cisneros worked to improve the lives of their clergy and the education of the people. The Jesuits, in particular, played a significant role in evangelizing Spain. They saw the rural areas as mission fields, much like the New World, where they could spread the word of God. Jesuits like Pedro de Leon traveled extensively, working to bring the faith to the most remote and neglected parts of the country. The Inquisition's involvement in these efforts was significant, but it was always a supporting role. While inquisitors conducted visitations and prosecuted offenses, their methods were often heavy-handed and alienating. Unlike the local clergy, who were part of the community and could use persuasion, the inquisitors were outsiders who relied on fear and punishment. This made their efforts less effective and sometimes counterproductive. The shift in the Inquisition's focus from heretics to the general population began in the mid-16th century. Reformist clergy, inspired by the Jesuits, became concerned about the low levels of moral and spiritual life among the people. They began to take action against non-Christian behavior, and the Inquisition followed suit. From the 1560s, the number of prosecutions for offenses like blasphemy and immoral statements increased. These cases often involved ordinary people who, in moments of anger or stress, said things that were deemed offensive to the Church. The Inquisition's role in disciplining the Catholic laity was part of a broader effort to reform religious practices in Spain. It worked alongside other church institutions, but its methods and approach made its contributions less successful and often more controversial. Despite the Inquisition's efforts, the religious life of the Spanish people remained a mix of tradition, ritual, and often shallow faith, reflecting the complex and challenging environment in which it operated. In the world of medieval and early modern Spain, words mattered a lot. In a time when most people couldn't read or write, what you said was more important than what you wrote. Imagine a world where there were no text messages, no emails, and no written contracts. Instead, everything from promises to legal testimonies was spoken aloud. A man's word was his bond, and people took what others said very seriously. In this world, insults and slander were taken just as seriously as today. If you said something mean or false about your neighbor, or if you spoke against God or the Church, you could get in big trouble. Both the state and the Church were quick to punish these kinds of verbal offenses because they believed such words could disrupt the peace of the community. But it wasn't just the authorities who were on the lookout for offensive words. Often, it was the people themselves out of malice or a sense of religious duty who reported others for what they had said. The Inquisition, a religious court, played a significant role in monitoring and punishing these verbal offenses. However, it's important to understand that the Inquisition didn't go around hunting for people who said the wrong things. Most of the cases they dealt with were brought to them by members of the public. For example, if two neighbors got into a fight and one of them insulted the other, the offended party might report the insult to the Inquisition. The Inquisition would then step in to resolve the conflict, often acting more like a mediator than a judge. One interesting case from 1673 shows how the Inquisition worked. In a town called Alcázar de San Juan, two rival parishes were praying for rain. One man, Francisco Millan, from the parish of Sta Maria, shouted an insult at the other parish, saying that instead of rain, they would get testicles, which was a crude way of saying they would get nothing. The other parish reported him to the Inquisition, which was nearby. The inquisitors, concerned about keeping the peace, recommended that Millan leave the town for 4 years. This case shows that the Inquisition was more interested in maintaining community harmony than in punishing people for their words. The Inquisition also dealt with blasphemy, which was considered a serious offense. Blasphemy could be anything from using God's name in vain to making obscene references to religious figures. The Inquisition had a broad definition of blasphemy, which sometimes led to conflicts with secular authorities. For example, in 1534, the courts, a kind of parliament in Madrid, asked that cases of blasphemy be handled by the secular courts, not the Inquisition. However, the Inquisition continued to intervene, often punishing people for using bad language in public or failing to follow religious practices like going to Mass. The Inquisition also kept a close eye on the clergy, especially in cases of solicitation during confession. Confession was a sacred ritual where people would tell a priest their sins and receive forgiveness. However, some priests used this moment to take advantage of their penitence. The Inquisition tried to prevent this by punishing priests who misused the sacrament. One famous case from 1581 involved a Franciscan friar who slapped a woman on the buttocks during confession. These cases were taken very seriously, and the Inquisition worked to ensure that the sacrament of confession remained a sacred and safe space. Despite its efforts, the Inquisition struggled to improve religious knowledge among the general population. Many people, especially in rural areas, were ignorant of basic Christian beliefs. The Inquisition would often test people's knowledge of prayers and doctrines, but this didn't seem to make much of a difference over time. Even in the late 17th century, many people could only recite the Our Father and the Hail Mary, and knew little else about their faith. The Inquisition's attempts to control words and actions were a significant part of its history. From dealing with insults and blasphemy to regulating art and the behavior of clergy, the Inquisition was deeply involved in the religious and social life of early modern Spain. While it had limited success in improving religious education, It did play a role in promoting a new respect for the sacred in art, public devotions, and sermon. In the end, the Inquisition's impact on Spanish society was complex. It was not a simple matter of hunting heretics or imposing strict control. Instead, it was a part of the broader effort to maintain social order and religious harmony in a time when words carried a lot of weight. Despite its flaws and limitations, the Inquisition left a lasting mark on the religious and cultural landscape of Spain.